So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're taking a look at the second half of a video by Tomorrow's World with speaker Wallace Smith. Last time we got, well, nothing. The framing device for this is that we're learning about the 4 secrets that evolutionists don't want you to know. So far the other secrets have been less secrets that evolutionists don't want you to know, and more made-up nonsense and bad math. But hey, let's see what the next, and possibly first secret is.
The gaps in the fossil record since Darwin's day have gotten worse, not better.
Dr. Banjo?
In the fur. And I remind you that evolution is merely a theory, like gravity or the shape of the Earth. If your elitist East Coast evolution is real, why has no one found the missing link between modern humans and ancient apes?
We did find it. It's called Homo erectus.
Then you have proven my case, sir. For no one has found the link between apes and this Homo erectus. I've got you now. Fair enough. But where, then, is the missing link between apes and this Darwinius Macilli? Answer me that, Professor.
Every time an alleged gap is filled, it just creates 2 more gaps, right?
The theory of evolution depends on the slow and steady accumulation of small variations.
Actually, the pace can vary considerably depending on the environment and how it changes. That being said, I don't think I'd generally call it fast on a human timescale.
Since large jumps in changes would imply an active designer or planner.
No, they'd imply a change to an important regulatory gene that's probably active during embryonic development, but whatever.
The result should be a smooth transition in the fossil record.
That would require all organisms to have the same chance at fossilization, and for that chance to be fairly high, and for fossils to always persist to the present, and for us to have discovered essentially everything in the fossil record. We know that none of these things are true. In most circumstances, big things are more likely to fossilize than small things. Some environments like forests are just bad at forming fossils. Organisms without biomineralized parts are unlikely to fossilize at all, etc. So we know that not all organisms are equally likely to fossilize, meaning that we should find less than all species. Further, the chances of fossilization are low for each individual, meaning that again, we should not have a fully complete fossil record, since some groups of organisms will fail to leave behind a fossil for this reason alone, even if they lived in a place that can and did form fossils. Further, we can see erosion in many places that has cut through fossil-bearing layers. Indeed, that's how we generally find fossiliferous formations. But that also means that the fossils that were in what is now negative space are gone, and they could well have been unique. Meaning that some fossils, including whole species, are almost certainly lost to us simply because we didn't dig them up soon enough. Finally, we know that we have not found even close to everything in the fossil record because we keep finding new stuff. Think about it this way. Suppose you had a 42-gallon oil barrel, the standard barrel size for oil. Into that, I place nearly 42 gallons of colored beads that I purchased from an arts and crafts store. Now, I did this by purchasing many bags of the same beads from the same manufacturer who only manufactures a set number of colors. Your job is to figure out how many colors there are in the barrel. All you're allowed to do is draw 1 bead at a time while blindfolded, and then look at them. At first, you will pick new colors frequently, and let's say you sort them into groups by color. After a while, you stop pulling up new colors, and after a while, you have a fairly sizable pile of beads of all, say, 12 colors. And it has been a long time since you've picked up a new color. Chances are that that's how many colors there are, and you can safely say that either you have discovered all the colors, or that any other colors that might be in there are exceptionally rare and unlikely to be found. You have a likely complete picture of the contents of the oil barrel full of beads. Since we are still frequently finding new organisms in the fossil record, we are clearly still at the beginning stage of this, where we cannot say that we know what's in the fossil record completely. Indeed, we probably only have a small fraction of what's preserved in it. So yeah, we should expect there to be gaps in the fossil record, but evolution predicts that we should also find transitional fossils, and creation predicts that we should not. But, we do.
With animals gradually, almost imperceptibly, turning into new animals through small, smooth changes. But this is not what the fossil record shows.
Actually, it does for certain definitions of small and smooth.
Instead of a smooth, continuous transition of creatures,
And remember, for the reasons already stated earlier, we absolutely do not expect the record to be continuous, although in some limestone formations, the considerable evolution of coccolithophores is in fact smooth and continuous. So we actually do have a good record for some groups of organisms. It's just that they're not big or furry or cute, so creationists don't care about them, and just assume that you don't either. But they're just as much alive and evidence of evolution as anything else, like tigers or puppies.
the record indicates gaps between different kinds of creatures.
Well, we wouldn't expect to see a transition between bearded lizards and birds, since they didn't evolve from each other, and the common ancestor would have been some basal diapsid, of which we have a lot. Petrolacosaurus being just one example of an organism that is typical of what such an organism would look like. It's not a lizard, it's not a bird, but it's a reptile.
As Michael Denton wrote in his seminal work, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis,
A book published some 40 years ago, and during the time since, evolution has kept on keeping on, while the share of people who accept young Earth creationism has steadily declined. I don't know what definition of crisis Wallace is using, but for me, if something can just continue on for 4 decades while its opposition shrinks with no real challenges during those 4 decades, then whatever the situation is, it's not a crisis. Maybe evolution should be in crisis, but it clearly is not.
the overall picture of life on Earth today is so discontinuous. The gaps between the different types so obvious that, as Stephen Stanley reminds us in his recent book,
By recent, Denton means 1979. It was a book written to argue for punctuated equilibrium, and it seems not to have done too well. I want to thank Metageeky from my Discord and John from the Science Friends for assisting me with tracking all this down.
macroevolution. If our knowledge of biology was restricted to those species presently existing on Earth, we might wonder whether the doctrine of evolution would qualify as anything more than an outrageous hypothesis.
Maybe back in the 1980s we would have wondered about that. Of course, what this quote implies is that the fossil record actually shows us otherwise, because the quote is restricted to extant species. And on top of that, we also have the full genomes of multiple organisms from many branches of the tree of life, and the morphology of extant species, the fossil record, and genetics all work together to confirm evolution, both in the sense of the process as well as in terms of the fact of common ancestry. In fact, the quote itself doesn't actually imply that. The weirdly truncated version does. The whole sentence is, quote, "In the absence of a fossil record, the credibility of evolutionists would qualify as anything more than an outrageous hypothesis," end quote. The whole point is that the fossil record does show us the transitions that evolution predicts, although the author will go on to argue for punctuated equilibrium and what he calls quantum speciation, whatever the heck that is.
Without intermediates or transitional forms to bridge the enormous gaps which separate existing species and groups of organisms, the concept of evolution could never be taken seriously as a scientific hypothesis.
Well, first, I disagree, but fortunately, Denton's own source says that we do in fact have the fossils.
Of course, seemingly continuous lines of some animals are trotted out for display to pretend the gaps are not nearly as damaging as they are.
In other words, well, sure, there are actually very smooth transitional sequences in the fossil record that creationism never predicted and that evolution did. But because that's not true of all lineages, then we still win, even though we have no evidence and evolution does.
For instance, you will see theoretical sequences for whale, horse, and human evolution.
You sure will, and more. Let's look. The thing is, none of those animals is theoretical. We have the fossils. Now, all phylogenies are hypotheses as well as conclusions of studies, and those that include forms like Eohippus or Ambulocetus are hypotheses as well. But the thing is, they're hypotheses that creationists also make, since they accept limited common ancestry and don't have any extra access to genealogical information about animals any more so than anyone else does. And further, this is exactly what evolution predicts we should find. Would it be great if every fossil came with a family tree all neatly printed out? Sure, but that's not the world we find ourselves in.
Yet not only are these sequences themselves deceptive
Yeah, I'm going to need some kind of evidence for that well-poisoning claim.
and not proven lines of descent at all,
Yeah, congrats, that's science. Nothing is proven. If you want proof, go do math.
the fact remains that if evolution is true, these sorts of sequences should be the norm, not the rare exception.
No, they should in fact be fairly uncommon. I hate to repeat myself, but I suppose I must. That would require all organisms to have the same chance at fossilization, and for that chance to be fairly high, and for fossils to always persist to the present, and for us to have discovered essentially everything in the fossil record. We know that none of these things are true. In most circumstances, big things are more likely to fossilize than small things. Some environments like forests are just bad at forming fossils. Organisms without biomineralized parts are unlikely to fossilize at all, etc. So we know that not all organisms are equally likely to fossilize, meaning that we should find less than all species. Further, the chances of fossilization are low for each individual, meaning that again, we should not have a fully complete fossil record, since some groups of organisms will fail to leave behind a fossil for this reason alone, even if they lived in a place that can and did form fossils. Further, we can see erosion in many places that has cut through fossil-bearing layers. Indeed, that's how we generally find fossiliferous formations. But that also means that the fossils that were in what is now negative space are gone, and they could well have been unique. Meaning that some fossils, including whole species, are almost certainly lost to us simply because we didn't dig them up soon enough. Finally, we know that we have not found even close to everything in the fossil record because we keep finding new stuff. Think about it this way. Suppose you had a 42-gallon oil barrel, the standard barrel size for oil. Into that, I place nearly 42 gallons of colored beads that I purchased from an arts and crafts store. Now, I did this by purchasing many bags of the same beads from the same manufacturer who only manufactures a set number of colors. Your job is to figure out how many colors there are in the barrel. All you're allowed to do is draw one bead at a time while blindfolded, and then look at them. At first, you will pick new colors frequently, and let's say you sort them into groups by color. After a while, you stop pulling up new colors, and after a while, you have a fairly sizable pile of beads of all, say, 12 colors. And it has been a long time since you've picked up a new color. Chances are that that's how many colors there are, and you can safely say that either you have discovered all the colors, or that any other colors that might be in there are exceptionally rare and unlikely to be found. You have a likely complete picture of the contents of the oil barrel full of beads. Since we are still frequently finding new organisms in the fossil record, we are clearly still at the beginning stage of this, where we cannot say that we know what's in the fossil record completely. Indeed, we probably only have a small fraction of what's preserved in it. So yeah, we should expect there to be gaps in the fossil record, but evolution predicts that we should also find transitional fossils, and creation predicts that we should not. But, we do.
Ironically, evolutionists often accuse believers of having faith in a God of the gaps.
It's not ironic, it's literally true. Creationists love to shove God into any area of science that is not well understood by themselves, regardless of whether it's well understood by scientists. How did geology get that way? Well, creationists not only don't know, but they can't understand it, so they say God did it with a flood. How did biological diversity arise? Well, creationists not only don't know, but they can't understand it, so they say God did it with his speech. How can we see the stars if they're so distant that the light couldn't have reached us in 6,000 years? Well, again, creationists not only don't know, but can't understand it. So they just make up excuses like geocentrism, but just for light, or that God is just a liar sometimes.
Who magically does all the things they cannot explain.
Exactly, because God is both the perfect and most useless explanation. An omnipotent being can be used to explain anything, which means that in reality it explains nothing. And creationists by definition invoke this explanation. Explanations are kind of like words. Paradoxically, if they seem to explain too much, they become less useful. Let's consider the famous English pseudo-sentence, buffalo, 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 buffalo. I call it a pseudo-sentence because while if you look up buffalo in the dictionary and you have a grasp of English grammar, you can in fact parse that sentence. I have never, however, met a native English speaker who has been able to parse that sentence without effort, and instead it is almost always interpreted as a meaningless repetition of the word buffalo. In point of fact, it relies on 3 uses of the word buffalo. These are the 3 definitions that we have to use to understand this. First, Buffalo is the name of a city in the state of New York. Second, it is a common name for the American bison, bison, bison. And last, it is a verb meaning to bully or harass. The whole sentence means Buffalo from Buffalo, New York, bully Buffalo from Buffalo, New York. But imagine if the word buffalo had many other definitions, such that one could write a whole book using it, and technically it could mean something. The problem is, as we can see, that the more things a particular word means, the more times it's used in a sentence with different meanings, the harder it is to parse any meaning at all. So you can see that at some point, adding definitions to a word actually makes it less useful, since it becomes hard to understand which meaning someone might be using. Similarly, if an explanation can explain everything, it stops being so useful. A real-world example is gravity, which technically explains dam breaks, airplane crashes, building collapses, bridge collapses, many broken bones, even some aspects of heart disease. But it's kind of useless in those areas. If someone wants to know what caused a plane to crash into the ground, saying gravity doesn't help. We can't do anything with that, even though in some sense it's true. What we're looking for is a useful explanation, and in the case of the plane crash, maybe it's engine trouble that we could fix with a new maintenance schedule, or maybe it's a design flaw that engineers will have to address. Those are useful, but they also aren't as widespread. Obviously, an engine problem in the plane isn't the cause for a building collapse. In that case, it might be the shifting of the foundation as a result of underground water erosion. So you can see why gravity can be such a broad explanation that it stops being useful in some contexts. Similarly, but to an even greater degree, since God is supposed to be able to explain literally any observation, God is a useless explanation in most cases, whether God exists or not. For example, why did the plane fall? God willed it. Well, that doesn't help us prevent future planes from falling. Why did the bridge collapse? God willed it. Again, not helpful. Why do people get sick? God is punishing them. Well, that doesn't suggest any treatments. Why is my computer overheating? God willed it. That doesn't really help me adjust my computer settings to deal with a problem. God is almost always the worst explanation you can give for anything.
Such a misunderstanding aside,
is it a misunderstanding, or is Wallace just embarrassed by its accuracy to the point that he'll just dismiss it because he knows he can't argue against it? Let me know in the comments.
the unexplainable gaps in the fossil record,
which do not exist. Gaps are the default. We expect most organisms not to fossilize. Therefore, the fossil record will be full of gaps of varying sizes. It's kind of like poverty. No one comes into the world having anything of value beyond their body by simple nature of having been born. Everything anyone has been worked for by someone, or in most cases, many someones. And your possession of it is usually due to either people wanting you to have it and so giving it to you, or you're getting it through in some manner working for it, whether that be in some kind of barter arrangement or through the use of money. Whenever people exist without significant material wealth, that's just the default human condition. The question is why this has ever changed. Are the systems that have changed this just or not? And is there a way to alleviate the rather dire natural condition of humans? Similarly, the default for an organism is that it rot away to nothing, leaving no fossils at all. There not being a fossil for something doesn't demand an explanation. It's the fossils that do exist that demand explanation, and that's why the science of taphonomy exists.
A thorn in Darwin's side that remains just as thorny more than 150 years later turned the tables and put evolutionists in the place of wielding blind faith and believing in a Darwin of the gaps.
First, Darwin is not synonymous with evolutionary theory. Second, there is nothing to explain in the fact that the fossil record is not complete with every organism. Third, evolution is in fact an explanation that is useful, unlike God, so these are not analogous situations. Evolution is testable, falsifiable, makes predictions, and suggests future research. Saying God does not do that. It doesn't do any of it. Further, there are many things which evolution is not invoked to explain. There are problems unifying particle physics and relativity. No one suggests that biological evolution solves this problem. Now, in some cases, just evolution can be an overly broad explanation, but that's why it's not just a single word, it's a whole theoretical framework with multiple mechanisms, limitations, and predictions. We can and do go into explanations like natural selection, sexual selection, adaptive radiation, niche partitioning, genetic drift, niche construction, etc.
For our next dirty secret,
That was it? Just the fossil record doesn't have every organism ever? That's not a secret. This is unbelievably pathetic.
all you need to do is look in the mirror at your remarkable evolution-defying eyes.
Really? This? Okay, sure. Let's do it.
Because evolution continues to offer no good explanation for how new organs can form.
They form from old organs. The clavicle and skull are actually formed from skin. The lungs are formed from the digestive system, and so on. In fact, you can find many organisms with much more primitive organ systems that lack many of the organs you take for granted. An example might be flatworms, which do not really have dedicated respiratory organs, eyes, or much else beyond some muscles and a tube for eating. And how does this change? Well, mutation, obviously. We'll take the lungs as an example. Those are an outgrowth of the gut, and the gut can in fact absorb oxygen. Even today, many fish that lack lungs will still gulp air in low oxygen situations. That air goes into their digestive tract, where the oxygen diffuses into their bloodstream. Similarly, some turtles absorb small amounts of oxygen through their anuses, which is just the other end of the digestive tract. So a mutation that creates a small pocket of outgrowth in the digestive tract is the start of lungs. Once such a growth exists, if it is helping the fish that have it with their oxygenation problems, then it is going to be favored by natural selection, and then it can grow bigger, gain folds for additional surface area, get more blood supply, all through the ordinary, everyday kinds of mutations that we see all the time. Nothing unusual happens, and at no point would you say that one fish had a new organ that its parents didn't have. Just like no one ever spoke Latin and then gave birth to a kid who spoke French, it didn't happen with organs either. New languages, like new organs, can only be identified in hindsight. On the ground, when they're forming, they're just minor changes to the already existing language or organs.
In the Psalms, King David praises God and proclaims to his creator.
Don't care. This isn't Bible Hour. If you want one of those, let me know in the comments and I can set one up with Dr. Kip Davis and Vishanti.
After all, organs represent not just specialized tissues, but interwoven systems, often systems upon systems.
That's true enough. All organs interact with other organs. I'm not sure why that is seen as a problem for evolution, though.
Finely tuned and exquisitely structured to work together.
Yeah, that's kind of the point of natural selection. Anything that improves the ability of an organism to survive, to reproduce, and for those offspring to do the same, will tend to increase in frequency. That includes things like better integration of organs and organ systems. This is the very thing that evolution explains. Pointing this out as a problem for evolution is like pointing out the well-characterized orbits of the planets of the solar system as an argument against the theory of universal gravitation, or like pointing to diseases existing as an argument against the germ theory of disease. You can't simply point to the things a theory is about and then declare that because they exist, the theory doesn't work. I mean, I guess you can, but it's a really stupid thing to do.
And if one part is missing, the whole can fail.
And we are on to irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity grows right out of the seed sown by William Paley's watchmaker argument. Paley's original argument went that if you found a watch on the beach and looked at it, you would infer design from the complex interactions of its well-matched parts. Later, Michael Behe from the Discovery Institute updated this idea to his idea of irreducible complexity, which claims that a system is irreducibly complex if it is composed of multiple well-matched parts such that the removal of any part will cause the system to no longer function. He then made the claim that such systems could not evolve by Darwinian processes, and so if any such biological systems exist, they cannot be explained by evolution. Of course, we already pre-debunked this when discussing HIV group 1 VPU protein, but I suppose we might as well go further into it now. First, strictly speaking, Darwinian mechanisms only really encompass natural, artificial, and sexual selection. They don't even really include mutation, and certainly not genetic drift, gene flow, etc. So if Behe means by Darwinian strictly those mechanisms known to Darwin, then this is a non-starter, because there are other processes. However, since he did say in a talk with friend of the channel Dan Cardinal that he means unguided mindless processes, I'll accept that he actually means evolutionary mechanism, not Darwinian mechanism. Second, it's simply not true that this is a barrier to evolution. We have seen irreducibly complex systems, including the aforementioned VPU protein, as well as the ability of E. coli to metabolize citrate in aerobic conditions, evolve in real time. Further, we understand quite well how other irreducibly complex systems evolved, including some of Behe's favorite examples, including the bacterial flagellum, the mammal blood clotting cascade, and the eye, the very thing we're talking about. So irreducible complexity is completely pointless as an argument because we know it's not a barrier to evolution. Third, the eye isn't really irreducibly complex. Many parts of it can be removed and you will still be able to see. Granted, not nearly as well, but the definition is that the system won't function, not that it will function at a reduced capacity. In fact, that a system would function at a reduced capacity if a part were removed is proof that that system is not irreducibly complex. For example, if you remove the iris and your pupils were of a fixed diameter, you'd have a harder time adapting to different light levels, but you would still be able to see. You can tell this is true if you've ever had your eyes dilated. While it doesn't remove your iris, it does stop it from functioning and leaves it stuck maximally open. While it's not a fun time, it doesn't blind you. Similarly, if you remove the lens, everything would be very blurry, but you'd still get information about how bright it is, the direction the light is coming from, and so on. That's not much, but it's also not nothing. So even if we ignore the first two parts, the eye isn't even irreducibly complex in the first place.
And improving the entire organ would often involve each piece or part evolving in conjunction with all the other pieces in a coordinated way.
Yeah, of course it would. That's how natural selection works. The whole organism is evolving in coordination with itself and its conspecifics, as well as the environment. Everything affects everything else, and whether a mutation is beneficial or detrimental is contingent. Only artificial selection tends to select for particular morphological traits without concern for how that affects the rest of the organism. That's why we get dogs with faces that make it nearly impossible for them to breathe through, or hip dysplasia, or horrible joint pains from being entirely too big. On the other hand, natural selection does not favor a mutation that might enhance one part of an organism, but to the net detriment of the organism.
A coordination that evolution does not allow.
In fact, it requires it. Natural selection happens in the real world, and so anything that's real that affects an organism's fitness is subject to natural selection. That includes self-interaction among organs and parts of organs. If an organism mutated to have, say, an optic nerve, but did not have light-sensitive cells, there would be no advantage. And since nerves take energy to make, there may well be a detriment. But on the other hand, if there is already a set of light-sensitive cells, then the nerves going between them and the brain allows for better processing of the light signals that may have previously only been hormonal, allowing for the brain to process visual stimuli as opposed to before, which may have been fine for circadian rhythms, but not, say, for predator evasion. That evolution acts on the whole organism in the context of its environment is one of the most basic facts about evolution. There is no way to make this claim without either a near total ignorance of the theory of evolution, or without lying. Since I don't know Wallace's credentials, I'm fine with attributing this to ignorance, at least for now. But if you know so little about a subject, you might not want to try to debunk it. I doubt Wallace would find it very persuasive if I told him that the reason Christianity is false is that the resurrection of Jesus, as well as his assumption into heaven, were real true historical events. He'd probably rightly point out that not only is that not a reason Christianity is false, but it is rather a requirement for Christianity.
The problem was summarized not long ago in an article in The Guardian.
I get so tired of creationists not citing real scientific literature. The Guardian isn't a peer-reviewed source, and it can't be trusted to report accurately on science. Science isn't hashed out in newspapers, tabloids, on YouTubes, or in debate halls. It's done in the literature. If you want to know what the science is on a topic, go to the actual literature.
First, the paper gives the traditional explanation for the supposed evolution of the eye.
It's not a paper, it's an article for an online edition of a magazine for lay people.
Given by thousands of teachers over the decades to tens of thousands of students.
And it's given to those students for the very good reason that it is supported by genetics, the fossil record, and the eyes that exist in living things that are still around today. Nothing in that article or the paper it's based on changes any of that.
Animals that have light-sensitive cells for some reason.
It's not for some reason. We know this too. The proteins that detect light in photosensitive cells are called opsins, and they are a group of proteins in the larger protein family known as G-protein-coupled receptors. These transmembrane proteins mostly detect molecules on the outside surface of the cell membrane, providing information about the cell surroundings to the interior of the cell. The big difference between opsins and their cousins are that opsins detect photons, not molecules. But all of these G-protein-coupled receptor proteins share an evolutionary lineage which is seen both in their common structure of dipping in and out of the cell 7 times in 6 loops, as well as their genetic sequence. This is simply the result of mutation to ancestral receptor proteins, and once that's done, since there's already a biochemical pathway for these proteins to communicate with the rest of the cell, that's all that's needed. Everything else is already established. So the reason that some cells are light sensitive is that it's a really easy thing to accidentally become light sensitive. That's it. There's no need for there to be a design for this, or for it to be a plan. It's just the sort of thing that can happen with some minor mutations.
Experience a series of slight mutations that increasingly give them survival advantages.
Yeah, like having cells that are light sensitive concentrated in the dermal tissue, then perhaps concentrated at one end of the animal. That would make this part of the process of cephalization, that is, the creation of a head. It turns out that heads have evolved a few times independently, because it seems like it's a pretty good strategy to put the brain, sensory organs, and feeding apparatus all in close proximity to each other, and sort of at the front of the animal.
Such as the slight cupping of the flesh around the cells that helps to focus the light.
Specifically, this gives information about the direction of the light. At shallow angles, part of such a cup of cells will be in shadow, meaning that the direction the light is coming from is going to be the side that has some shadows. This is more information than before, and can help with navigation as well as more complex predator avoidance than is afforded by just a photosensitive patch of cells. For at least some animals, these added abilities are a clear advantage to survival and therefore reproduction. I'm curious as to whether Wallace thinks that that's not advantageous, or if he thinks that such change can't happen through mutation. Otherwise, I'm not sure what his objection would be.
A clear covering of some sort eventually to seal the space which slowly becomes a lens.
Actually, any clear covering is already a lens. Of course, he has skipped over the pinhole camera eye, which is odd since it's the kind of eye that the modern Nautilus has. In this eye, the cup shape is far more extreme and leaves only a small hole above the photosensitive cells. This allows an actual image to form, but because the aperture through which the light enters the eye is very small, the image is dim. The clear substance, just by existing, will gather additional light because of refraction, causing light to bend towards the iris of the eye. That allows for a brighter image, and also, if the clear thing is flexible, then changing its shape can change the focal point of the eye. Some eye lenses can't do that. For example, the calcite eyes of trilobites were quite rigid and had a fixed focal distance, unlike the tetrapod eye, which can focus at a wide range of distances.
Then muscles arrive to shape and focus the lens better.
It depends. Not all eyes have muscles that shape or focus the eye, or even move the eye. Trilobites didn't have any of that, neither do spiders or other arachnids. Crustaceans only have muscles that move the eye stalks in those species that have them. Further, since both skulls and eyes in tetrapods grow out of what is essentially dermal tissue, and dermal tissues already have muscles attached, it's not really a huge stretch for muscles to attach from the skull to the eyes.
Etc.
Etc., etc., etc.
The Guardian continues. This is the basic story of evolution, as recounted in countless textbooks and pop science bestsellers.
Yep, because not only is it plausible, we have fossils and living examples of all stages, so we know that all of them work.
The problem, according to a growing number of scientists,
virtually none of whom are evolutionary biologists, but instead tend to be philosophers, mathematicians, and computer scientists. Because I know where this is going. This is Dennis Noble's extended evolutionary synthesis bullshit. But let's let Wallace continue.
is that it is absurdly crude and misleading.
Well, it's certainly crude in the sense that it's a high-level overview, since most lay audiences probably don't want to hear all about SNPs and DNA translocations and opsin functional groups. As for misleading, I disagree. It's misleading in the same way that saying the planets orbit the sun is misleading, since they really orbit the barycenter of the solar system. But the thing is, that's a complex topic about summing forces and whatnot, and the barycenter of the solar system is so close to being the sun that for the purposes of telling people who aren't working at flight planning in NASA how space works, it's fine to just say the planets orbit the sun. And that's the thing, virtually everything you know about science is wrong at some level analysis, because it's far more complex than you know, unless you're an expert in that particular thing.
For one thing, it starts midway through the story.
No, it starts at the earliest point that we can say it's still the story of eyes. We start with opsins. Any earlier and there's no light sensitivity, so it's not the story of eyes. If someone asks you where you got that cute top you're wearing, you don't start with the story of the Big Bang. You're also not likely to even start with the sweatshop in Southeast Asia where it was made. You're probably going to say what company sold it to you directly.
Taking for granted the existence of light-sensitive cells, lenses, and irises.
Nope, it doesn't do that. As we've already gone over, we know how light sensitivity evolved. Through the mutation of transmembrane proteins that still exist and still do non-light sensing things, like sending signals about the chemistry outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. Lenses are just the deposition of anything that's optically clear. I'm not sure what kind of explanation you'd want for that. As for things like the iris, that's muscles. If you want to know how muscles evolved, that's a different question. But yeah, we could go into that. It also doesn't explain where electrons or protons come from, or how space-time warps. Basically, this is just the complaint that the story you asked for didn't start with a theory of everything and then proceed from there. Well, we don't have a theory of everything, and also that's not how stories work.
Without explaining where they came from in the first place.
Again, we have those explanations. Like, if I'm explaining to you how a car crash happened and I don't give you the history of vulcanized rubber, I'm not failing to explain the car crash. If I tell you how I managed to get a fancy shader on a 3D model in Blender, but I don't tell you all about the equations to simulate how light interacts with surfaces, I'm not failing to explain to you how I made the shader. This article is acting like a small child who realized that the question why can be asked infinitely is actually the height of intellectual ability, and being incensed that others might disagree.
Nor does it adequately explain how such delicate and easily disrupted components mesh together to form a single organ.
I don't even know what that objection means. If you know, tell me in the comments. I've got nothing.
And it isn't just eyes that the traditional theory struggles with.
Well, it doesn't struggle with eyes, like, at all, so that's a weird phrasing. The thing is that this is all just a propaganda piece for a particular group that are often advocating for something called the extended evolutionary synthesis. This group believes that evolutionary biology isn't integrating things like niche construction, the influence on environment of organisms as opposed to the influence of the environment on organisms, epigenetics, and induced mutation. They want to see these things integrated into evolutionary biology instead of focusing on mutation and selection and drift. But the thing is, all of those things are integrated into biological evolution. And the reason that these advocates think otherwise is that they're mostly not actually in the field of evolutionary biology. They're basically a bunch of people who really don't know anything about cars coming into a mechanic shop and telling the mechanics that they aren't actually integrating air filters and motor oil into their car repair ideas. The mechanics, of course, are doing so, and have been for longer than those people have even been in the shop, and so they rightly ignore this. But the further problem is that while the extended evolutionary synthesis is basically just a bunch of people who don't know what they're talking about, and whining that the real experts don't pay them any attention, they offer no aid to young Earth creationism. None of them are disputing the age of the Earth, universal common ancestry, or change in allele frequencies in populations over time. They want a modified theory of evolution, but they have absolutely no time for young Earth creationism. This is not an example of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. These people, along with the actual evolutionary biologists, are united in having nothing that would make Wallace and his buddies anything other than still as far wrong as it is possible to be about most of science.
The first eye, the first wing, the first placenta, how they emerge.
The first eye was just the first photosensitive cells ever grouped together a little bit, and it evolved from a mutation to regulatory genes that cause cells in a particular region to overexpress opsins compared to other parts of the body. The first wing emerged when a limb became more important for its aerodynamic properties, which all limbs have, than for its properties as a ground or tree-based locomotor or manipulatory organ. The first placenta evolved when some fetal tissue gathered on the uterine wall, and that provided a barrier against maternal immune cells, as well as allowing limited nutrient flow from the mother to embryo. These aren't actually real mysteries. We might not know exactly which genes mutated in exactly which way for all of these, and all of them have evolved multiple times anyway, and so each eye, wing, and placenta has a different answer. But none of this is mysterious. All of them are just modifications of things that came before, skin, limbs, and largely undifferentiated fetal tissues, respectively. But further, even if these things were not known, that would make them unknown. Things being unknown is not a problem for a theory. It just means that we need to investigate them. And sure, doing so could always lead to a falsification of a theory, or a part thereof. But that's a good thing. Until that happens, though, it's not a problem for a theory. It's like a blank part of a map. That it's blank there doesn't mean that the rest of the map doesn't work.
Explaining these is the foundational motivation of evolutionary biology.
Is it? Because a lot of evolutionary biologists don't even work on animals at all. So I feel like it's not. Like if your area of interest in evolutionary biology is choanoflagellates, viruses, archaeans, or something like that, you don't give a damn about new organs because nothing you study even has organs in the first place. Maybe you study sponges, also called porphyrians. They don't even have tissues, despite being animals. You don't care about this at all, yet porphyrians, choanoflagellates, viruses, and archaeans evolve just as much as any animal with tissues and organs. There's a common psychological trap that a lot of people fall into, and it's related to plant blindness, but it's broader. Plant blindness is the tendency of humans to ignore plants as part of the environment, to treat them more like static rocks than as dynamic living things. You can see this in sci-fi movies, where the animals are all presented as strange alien creatures, but the plants are all just normal everyday earth plants. But this is part of a wider bias in humans. The less like a human something is, the less attention humans tend to pay to it. You can see it in creationist attempts to list kinds. In some cases, the kind is basically at the species level, like with humans. In the case of most mammals, they assume it's more like a family, like Felidae or Equidae. But then you get to frogs, and I've seen creationists say that frog is a kind, even though there's far more diversity in frogs than there is in, say, horses. I've even heard them say that bacteria is a kind, even though the diversity in bacteria is immensely more than can be seen in animals and plants put together. Here we have another example of this. The idea that evolution isn't just about animals. It's about eumetazoans specifically, more or less those animals that have tissues. But while evolutionary biology certainly is about such organisms, it's also about all other organisms too. So no, the desire to understand the origin of organs is not the brute motivation for evolutionary biology, and much evolutionary biology goes on in areas where there just are no organs.
Says Armin Mochek, a biologist at Indiana University.
And yep, he's one of the few actual credentialed biologists who have anything to do with the extended evolutionary synthesis. In fact, he has a bio page on extendedevolutionarysynthesis.com. And he is not someone arguing that we need a god to explain evolution, or that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. He's saying that the current mechanisms used in evolutionary biology are insufficient, and while he's wrong, let's pretend he's right and his pet mechanisms are actually the way that evolution proceeds to produce new organs. Are any of his mechanisms a god came down and just kinda did it that way? No, of course not. They're all just as naturalistic and non-personal as the mechanisms he finds inadequate. Of course, Wallace won't show that, because just like with Alan Fiducia being in no way a friend to creationists, yet still getting quote mined by them because he argues against science, and just like it happened with Stephen Jay Gould, where his arguments against gradualism were taken out of context to suppose he was giving comfort to creationist pseudoscience, the extended evolutionary synthesis guys are being misquoted as well. Not so much by the article, but by the creationists like Mr. Smith here. I find the extended evolutionary synthesis annoying, but it in no way is helpful to arguments for special creation or young Earth. In fact, don't take my word for it. Here's Dr. Zach B. Hancock, an evolutionary biologist involved in this very discussion and a friend of the channel.
Hi folks, my name's Zach Hancock. I'm an evolutionary biologist who specializes in population genetics. For me, the so-called extended evolutionary synthesis has three core issues. The first is that it isn't really a synthesis at all. In the 1940s, the modern synthesis was the unification of disparate fields of biology, each of which had their own theory of evolution. Geneticists were all mutationist, paleontologists were saltationist, embryologists believed in orthogenesis, etc. The synthesis swept all those theories of evolution away, showing that each field was consistent with the basic principles of Darwinian selection and Mendelian genetics. The extended synthesis, instead, is really just a laundry list of stuff supposedly left out of the modern synthesis. But claiming current theory doesn't sufficiently emphasize your favorite topic is not the material of a new synthesis. A new synthesis requires demonstrating how this stuff reveals fundamentally new processes of evolution, and further, how they integrate and build new connections between the known facts of evolution. Nothing in the so-called extended synthesis is truly synthetic. It's in fact a promotion of a pluralistic view of biology, with each field having its own pet ideas and emphasis. This is the exact opposite of a synthesis. This brings us to the second issue, the stuff supposedly left out of the modern synthesis. This reveals a deep ignorance of history, as virtually all their proposed extra mechanisms were investigated decades ago. For example, epigenetic inheritance was first observed in the late 1930s. It was called maternal effects because the phenotype of the offspring would resemble that of the mother irrespective of their genotype. These had made their ways into quantitative genetics textbooks by the 1970s. Lastly, and most importantly, the extended synthesis proponents fail to understand what constitutes a fundamental process of evolution. Evolutionary biologists seek to uncover the forces of the biological world that propel populations to change over time. For these processes to be considered fundamental, they should be emergent properties of any replicating biological system. That is, anywhere in the universe where life might emerge, these evolutionary forces should be at play. Importantly, this excludes anything that must itself have evolved. For example, development is not a fundamental evolutionary force because it had to emerge as multicellular eukaryotes evolved. Indeed, the vast majority of living things on the planet have no development at all. Similarly, transmission, be it genetic or epigenetic, is a necessary prerequisite for evolution, but it is not itself sufficient for evolution. This is due to the famous Hardy-Weinberg principle, which proves in the mathematical sense that inheritance alone, including epigenetics, does not change gene frequencies and thus is incapable of leading to evolution. Other forces must be at work. In effect, the extended synthesis crowd has has confused the sources of variation within populations with the evolutionary forces that act upon them. For example, the distribution of a given phenotype in a single generation is due to the combined effects of development, the environment, plasticity, etc. But the phenotypic distribution in the next generation is funneled through the classic evolutionary forces: selection, drift, mutation, and gene flow. That is, only these forces are capable of causing phenotypic distributions to change. There are near infinite sources of variation within populations, but there are only a handful of evolutionary forces that act upon them. Thus, if we take the extended synthesis laundry list of stuff seriously, it would necessitate an unnecessary ballooning of evolutionary theory to incorporate as core features each and every molecular detail of every living thing, ultimately obscuring the principles actually responsible for evolutionary change. In summary, the extended synthesis is 1. Not truly a synthesis, 2. Highlights topics already studied within evolutionary biology, and 3. Seeks to elevate non-fundamental sources of variation to the status of evolutionary forces, which ultimately muddies the principles of evolution. Now, let's say the extended synthesis crowd were correct, that evolutionary theory did need to be extended to incorporate their laundry list of understudied concepts. Would that somehow validate or even supply any evidence for young Earth creationism? Not in the slightest. For one, as I've already said, most of the points of the extended synthesis are studied as part of evolutionary theory and have been known about for decades. If they didn't help creationism in the 1960s, they sure aren't going to start helping them now just because they're under a new title. Secondly, the extended synthesis is not a critique of universal common descent, which is really what creationism is opposed to. It's an extension of the already known mechanisms of population change that creationists accept, like selection and mutation. The extended synthesis folk just add a few more items to this list. And lastly, the extended synthesis crowd see their version of evolution as even better at explaining the origin of biodiversity than the existing one. If we accept that as true, how could that do anything more than bury creationism even more than it already is? So, in a nutshell, that's why I think the extended synthesis is both nonsense and, even if it were true, no help whatsoever to young Earth creationism.
And here's a link to his channel. Please check it out, because few people besides Zach are really communicating the technical and mathematical aspects of population genetics and biological evolution quite like him. Or even at all.
In short, evolution promises us it can explain the organs of our bodies and how they supposedly formed gradually over millennia, but in reality, it hasn't a clue.
I mean, I don't know what else to say except that I think I've covered why that's just not at all true.
Our fourth dirty little secret, the fact that evolution continues to offer no good explanation for how new organs can form, is devastating to a theory that was developed more than 150 years ago to explain that very fact.
Even if it were true that the formation of new organs were some mystery that evolutionary biology had no answers for, that would not actually be devastating to the theory. The thing is that a theory isn't in trouble because there are unexplained phenomena. That just means that there's more work to do. Theories are in trouble when they're contradicted, not just when they're incomplete. All theories are incomplete to some degree. Think about physics. We know that relativity is a highly useful theory that gives us extremely accurate predictions about phenomena that should exist before we even detected them. What comes to mind most prominently are black holes and gravitational waves, both of which were predictions made decades ago which only much later were found to be accurate. On the other hand, the standard model of particle physics is similarly robust and accurate, but those two theories don't play together. We don't know how the world of quantum mechanics becomes the world of warped spacetime. We don't know how quarks and electrons function near black holes, or how at the level of individual particles the force of gravity is communicated. That's a problem only in the sense that it means that physicists have more work to do, and whatever the solution is, it won't contradict the parts of either theory that we know work well. Because if the solution did contradict that, then the solution would be at odds with the data, and that's no solution at all. Similarly, if evolution were still having trouble with the origin of organs, it would mean that there was still more work to do. But the twin-nested hierarchies of genetics and morphology, combined with observed evolution and the fossil record would still mean that we would have an overwhelming amount of evidence for common ancestry and change over time in lineages. Another way to think about it would be if you went to inspect the aftermath of a fire and you found a painting on a piece of wood on a table that was mysteriously unharmed. That doesn't mean that it wasn't a fire. It just means you don't know how that painting survived.
You know, let me confess something.
From a Christian organization, that is ominous given the heinous stuff that many of them get up to.
I know it's considered a cinema classic, but I've personally never been a big fan of The Wizard of Oz.
Okay, no one needs to like The Wizard of Oz, I guess. Also, fun fact, the snow in that movie was asbestos. So yeah, not a good time to be on that set. Well, to be fair, it's less that I know for certain that that's what the snow was, and more that that was the industry standard in Hollywood for fake snow, because people didn't really know about the hazards. So chances are quite low that it wasn't asbestos. But whatever, this isn't a show about how dangerous Hollywood could be.
Frankly, when I first saw it, I was a little kid, and the flying monkeys were pretty spooky.
I guess he's not a horror buff. That's too bad. I think horror is a lot of fun. But hey, to each his own.
But as I've grown older, one scene has remained with me and has become a real favorite.
Let me guess. It's the bit where they uncover the wizard and it's just some small man with a bunch of levers. If it's that, make sure you drink for a correct prediction.
It's close to the end of the movie as Dorothy and her band are confronting the terrifying wizard for the fact that he is failing to keep his promises.
Called it. Drink.
As they do so, flames shoot out, thunder crashes, and the wizard speaks to them as a giant green monstrous head, hovering in the air in front of them, shouting, "Do not arouse the wrath of the great and powerful Oz."
Let me know what you think in the comments, but it actually sounds like he does like the movie. Just maybe not the flying monkeys.
Meanwhile, Dorothy's dog Toto makes his way to a green curtain off to the left and pulls it aside to reveal a small, white-haired old man.
Oh wow, is the old man just like evolution? Is that the analogy?
Using a machine to create the illusion they're all looking at, and speaking into a microphone to amplify his voice and make it sound terrifying.
I'm skipping the rest of his description of this scene. It's one of the most famous scenes in all of cinema, and you've probably seen it. And if you haven't, I don't know, go watch The Wizard of Oz, I guess.
Well, the forces arrayed to convince people not to question the theory of evolution are very similar.
Except that there are no such forces. Science welcomes questions. It's just that if you want to contest a part of science, you need to have more than questions. You need evidence, and stronger evidence than that which is used by the consensus. And just coming up with 4 things that aren't true isn't going to cut it. Science is as it is because that's where the evidence points. Provide evidence for your ideas, or you're just not doing science, and creationists are not doing science.
There's a lot of thunder and flame, impressive proclamations about proof and evidence.
And that evidence is abundant and ubiquitous. We know evolution is true from direct observation, mathematical modeling, genomic comparisons, morphological studies, and the fossil record. Evolution is the unifying theory of all of biology. It guides fruitful research in all areas of biology, including paleontology and medicine. Evolution works. Creationism can barely accommodate some 10% of the data, and instead has to resort to telling lies like we've seen in this video from Wallace Smith here.
And a lot of theater designed to make you think that there's nothing to doubt.
If there were good reasons to doubt evolution, then I'd expect them to be presented. But time after time, all we get is this bullshit. I figured out it was bullshit in high school. What's Smith's excuse? I'll be honest with you, as I write this, I'm in a significant amount of physical pain as a result of a few factors, including an old injury. And frankly, I am out of to give to lying grifters who carry water for fascists and want to drag human knowledge back centuries. This guy is no different from the Taliban banning weather forecasts because only Allah knows the future, and so forecasting the weather is blasphemy. This man and people like him are getting people killed. Hell, the head of Health and Human Services in the former United States is an anti-vaxxer and likely an actual herald of Nurgle.
Gaze upon the dominion of life and decay. A fertile universe pregnant with flames. The time for virulent rebirth is upon you.
The guy pretending to be the Speaker of the House is a young Earth creationist with an author page on the Answers in Genesis website who is currently overseeing the final ceding of all authority from the legislature to the executive, paving the way for the US Senate to go the way of the Imperial Senate in Star Wars. Diseases are coming back. People think they can fix their hormone levels by eating beef fat and raw meat. And all the while, people like Smith here preach science denial. It's not okay, and it's gotta stop. I'm doing what I can here in my tiny corner of the internet to equip my viewers to not fall for this and hopefully maybe spread a little bit of real science literacy. We sure could use it. And you know what? I'll take this opportunity to shill my stuff. If you think what I'm doing here to spread awareness of science in the context of countering primarily creationist pseudoscience is valuable, and you have some money to spare, consider supporting me financially. This channel can only exist through the support of my audience. Probably the best way to support is Patreon. That's where I get to keep most of the money, and where it's easiest for me to budget from. The Patreon starts at $1 a month, and you can do an annual pledge for a 15% discount. The second best way to support me is the channel membership program, which you can join with the join button below this video. That starts at $1.99 a month. Both get you access to my supporters-only Discord, which is a friendly place to talk to other audience members and is also a very welcoming space for members of the LGBTQ+ community. Both also get you early access to scripted videos like this one, sometimes more than 6 months in advance. Anyway, enough of that, let's get back to Wally here.
But like the wizard, evolution has not kept its promises.
Theories don't make promises, they make testable predictions. In the case of evolutionary biology, those predictions keep coming true over and over. Maybe Allah just really likes evolution, like he seems to like those meteorologists who managed to successfully predict the weather. And he seems to really dislike creationists since their predictions routinely fail whenever they're at odds with those of evolution. And that's in the rare instances when they bother to even try putting forth testable hypotheses.
The theory promises an explanation of your origins, an explanation that needs no God.
Evolution has nothing to say about God. Just like the theory of universal gravitation doesn't invoke God to explain the orbits of the planets, the theory of evolution doesn't invoke God to explain biodiversity. They are not different. If the theory of universal gravitation does not negate the possibility of a God, then neither does the theory of evolution. Both, however, do remove some religious positions about the world as possible. For instance, we know that the Bible is wrong about the earth being flat, and similarly, it's wrong about when and how living things came about. Christians got over the flat earth thing. They can get over the evolution thing, and most already have.
No intelligence at all, just an initial microbe, careless natural processes, and a few billion years.
Yep.
We need to be willing to pull back the curtain, to not be so impressed by the theater that we don't question what we're shown.
Again, that's great, question everything, but be a skeptic, not a denialist. A skeptic is someone who does not accept a claim without good evidence, but who will examine proposed evidence in good faith and with an eye towards critical thinking. Skeptics will accept claims for which there is good evidence. Denialists, on the other hand, often like to call themselves skeptics, and sometimes we even go along with that, calling them climate skeptics or vaccine skeptics. But really, they are very little like skeptics. The only thing they have in common with skeptics is that they tend not to believe things just because people say them. But where a skeptic cares about evidence and critical thinking, a denialist just cares about their pet ideas being right, or the ideas they dislike being wrong. They will twist the evidence that can be twisted to fit their narrative. Other evidence will be ignored, and yet more evidence will be fabricated. The denialist is the one who vastly prefers a comforting lie over an uncomfortable truth. If climate skeptics were actually skeptics, they would accept the overwhelming evidence that climate change is real, dangerous, and primarily driven by human activity. If vaccine skeptics were really skeptics, they would accept the overwhelming evidence that all approved vaccines are safe and effective, with the caveat that some people may be allergic to some vaccine ingredients or be immunocompromised. And for those reasons, vaccines may not be safe for those particular people. If Wallace Smith were a real skeptic, he would accept the overwhelming evidence of common ancestry, the ancient age of the Earth, and the evidence against a global flood, etc. Don't be a denialist, be a real skeptic.
And to not be so intimidated that we aren't willing to stand up and call evolution out for not keeping its promises.
It is hard for me to think of a group that can less reasonably be said to be intimidated into silence than American evangelicals. They more or less run the country and have managed to convince themselves that any pushback on them trying to shove their identity down the throats of others who do not wish to share it constitutes oppression.
Or to borrow from another fiction, it might have been a hard day when you first learned Santa Claus wasn't real.
Well, now I have to go get a new irony meter. Damn it, this one was brand new too. Thanks, Wally, you dick.
But that realization brought you that much deeper into the real world.
Now do the same for Adam, Eve, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Joshua. they also didn't exist. Or if maybe Abraham and Moses did, it was certainly not in any way like the figures described in Genesis.
And much further from a world of make-believe.
I can't even imagine how little self-awareness this man must have. If only we could harness this negative self-awareness for power, we could solve all future energy crises.
Recognizing the dirty little secrets of evolution can help you step away from the world of make-believe as well.
Yes, and apparently into the world of talking snakes, talking donkeys, and sympathetic magic-based animal breeding. That's definitely not the world of make-believe. Not one bit. No siree.
Yet the questions evolutionists seek to answer remain. Where do we come from?
I come from the Morrison Formation.
How did life come to be?
I don't know.
Is there any purpose to it all?
There is if you want there to be, and if you don't, then no, there isn't. And that's true regardless of whether there's a God and whether or not he knows who you are.
And if so, what might that purpose be?
Everybody has to decide that for him or herself, regardless of whether any God exists. All a God does is give you an easy option, provided that God cares about you at all. Which I guess the Christian God does, but that's not the only God concept out there.
Unclouded by the evolutionary theater, you can seek the real answers to those questions.
The problem is, when all you care about is evidence, you arrive at the same answers as science. In order to come to the conclusions that Wally here would have you believe, you have to decide that those are the answers at the outset and then force any evidence to fit that narrative, or you have to ignore the evidence. That's why creationist publications that pretend to be journals start out by telling prospective authors that they must support the conclusions of young Earth creationism, or they can't publish. That's why non-creationists are routinely ghosted or given a runaround at such journals. Real journals don't have a statement of faith because they care about where the data lead, not following the accepted dogmas that they have to accept to remain in good standing with some religious club.
And if you really seek with an open mind and an open heart, with God's help, you will find your way to the only possible starting place in the search for those answers.
Well, since I decided to do an open and honest search for truth, I found that I had been lied to by people like Wallace Smith for my whole life up until that point. That wasn't a fun realization, and it was the first step on the road which led me here to running a YouTube channel aimed at countering this bullshit to the best of my ability.
The very first sentence of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Which gives us no predictions, suggests no new areas of study, allows for no technology to be developed. Even if that statement is true, it's completely useless from a scientific standpoint. All it is just comforting to some people, which is fine, but that's not what science is.
I hope you'll find the courage to look behind the curtain more often.
I do it all the time, and what I don't find is a scared old man. It's a robust and active field of study with new discoveries being made almost daily. All while some people cry because their favorite interpretation of their favorite book was disproved and they can't handle it. Because frankly, they never grew up. And the level of irony of those people who hate and want to erase science, of comparing what they're doing in trying to spread their ideas to getting people to stop believing in Santa, might be the most obscene thing I've seen in a while. Creationism is dangerous. Science denial gets people killed, and evangelical Christianity does too. I don't have any willpower left to be polite about this. Wallace Smith and those like him are enemies of humanity. They need to be opposed. This channel is my part of that fight. Consider what your part is. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please hit like on this video and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovind, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Eleron Teller, Philgavara, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Tapioca Weasel. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.